Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listeners, and welcome to another harrowing episode of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and tonight's story digs deep into grief, into vengeance, and into places not meant to be disturbed. We all cope with loss in our own way. Some try to forget, others lash out, and some go looking for answers in places best left unexplored. When love curdles into obsession and sorrow turns to rage, something old may answer your call, and what it brings with it may never go away. Before we begin, a reminder: if our stories keep you checking your locks and peering into the dark corners of your home, help us keep the nightmares coming. Leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Watching us on YouTube? Click that like button, comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe. And don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss another tale from the dark side. If that's not enough horror for you, visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and become a patron. For just $7.99 a month or less with an annual subscription, you'll unlock ad-free content, exclusive stories, and early access to episodes like this one. You'll also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, where the conversation never dies. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight's tale comes from author R.K. Kombrinck and is featured courtesy of Velox Books, where dark fiction lives and breathes. You can find more of their terrifying offerings at veloxbooks.com. In this story, a grieving brother takes matters into his own hands and into the darkness when his sister vanishes without a trace. But some doors, once opened, don't close again. And when you build a body to house your hate, you might not recognize what moves inside it. Performed by Geoff Sturtevant, this is Simulacrum by R.K. Kombrinck.
It had taken 19 days for Ian to finally find a book he could use. 19 long, weary days. It was not some old forbidden grimoire, hand-lettered by a 12th century sorcerer in human blood, bound in human skin. He hadn't pored over crumbling records in the dusty back room of an ancient library to find it. There were no cryptic puzzles that, once deciphered, would lead him to its location. He had spent hundreds of dollars on other publications, lexicons, pamphlets, manuals, and monographs, and a good many diabolical encyclopedia that all turned out to be useless. Countless hours had been wasted perusing the internet, always leading him on wild goose chases that only brought frustration. Ian had begun to lose hope that he was ever going to be able to fulfill his desire, and was nearing despair when, quite by accident, he found what he'd been looking for. He'd stumbled upon a website that did not seem to be what he considered complete bullshit, as so many of the others were. It was on the message board of this website that Ian discovered a thread posted by a member called Best Served Cold 74 that mentioned the title and purpose of a book. Another round of searches led him to the online catalog from which he could order a brand new paperback copy, and several clicks later, he had secured one for himself. He paid extra for rush delivery, and 2 days later, he was holding it in his hands. Upon receiving the book, Ian read several chapters and was relieved to find he would not have to kill anything for the ritual he'd be using. So far, he had performed 4 unsuccessful summonings, and 2 of them had required him to make a blood sacrifice. Ian was not a violent person under ordinary circumstances, and it broke his heart when he'd had to use his ceremonial blade, purchased for $99 from another occult website, on innocent, trusting strays he'd found wandering the neighborhood. Especially considering that their spilled blood had been wasted, failing to call anything forward to answer Ian's summons. The pain of those little murders, though, was nothing compared to the heartbreak that had driven him to this strange plan of vengeance in the first place. Every night he dreamed of Samantha screaming in terror and writhing in agony. Her absence dug a cavity into his heart and filled it with white-hot rage. It drove every molecule of remorse from his battered soul, and it was the image of her beautiful smiling face. Oh, how they had loved each other once. Why had she gone? That brought him to this nightmare purpose. Now it was time for him to try again. His mother and father were going out for the evening, and he didn't know when he'd have another chance like this. He'd come back to stay with them after Samantha left. He knew they were worried about him. The house was full of concerned looks and pauses, which might have become the beginnings of conversations. "Are you all right, son? How you holding up?" They seemed to want to ask him. But the words never came. They were a frozen lake that separated him from his parents. They could look at each other from across those unspoken words, but they couldn't reach one another. Ian watched from the window as his parents' car backed out of the driveway and buzzed off down the street. When he saw them turn the corner, he went down to the basement and prepared for the ceremony. When he was a teenager, the basement was where Ian went to be by himself. He'd had an old RCA stereo with a turntable and a tape deck, and he would sit in front of it for hours, listening to an endless loop of dark, moody music. Posters for fantasy movies and strange, obscure comic books adorned the dark-paneled walls. It was a world arranged and created by him. When he'd finally moved out as an adult, his parents had left everything the way it was down there. His bookshelves, bursting with secondhand paperbacks, his drawing table and art supplies, his stereo and his box full of tapes. It all sat there waiting, and when Ian moved back in after losing Samantha, descending those orange-carpeted steps was like crawling back through time. Sadly, not even the solace of his beloved basement could damp the fury that raged within him when he thought of Samantha. Why? The question clanged on and on in his mind like a litany. Why? 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 No matter how he attacked the problem, Ian could not understand why. No answer made sense. The universe pushed us down like bullies and stole from us, laughing, and then left us there on the ground, bleeding and alone. It had come to a point where he could not stop thinking about her. He imagined all sorts of scenarios. What if she had never left? What if they could still be together? Dark curiosities wormed and writhed within him that, try as he might, he could not force back down. Thoughts like where she might be and what she might be doing, and who she might be doing it with. they filled him with so much dread and hurt and scalding hatred that he sometimes found himself gasping for breath. That night, thoughts of Samantha swam freely in Ian's mind, mingling with dreams of dripping red revenge. They became inseparable. He decided that now was the moment to begin, while his intent burned hot upon his heart, close to the surface. He walked into the back room of the basement where his parents stored years' worth of discarded clothes and unused appliances. He pushed past boxes of junk and made his way to the back of the room where he'd hidden his small supply case. Inside the case, which was just a cheap plastic toolbox, were chalk and candles, matches, and a small bottle of oil, which had supposedly been infused with the sweat of a virgin. These were the implements Ian used when trying to call down into the dark, past the boundaries of our world, and into the stinking shadows beyond. Into the place where he hoped to contact something that might be willing to make a deal with him. He wanted to find something that smoldered with the desire to commit horrible atrocities on behalf of his pain. So far, he had been unable to raise anything to do his bidding, though at once, at the very end of a long and arduous ritual, he did hear a mad, echoing laughter bubble forth from the center of his circle for just a few moments. But he hoped that this ceremony, which was different than the others, might yield success. Ian took his toolbox out into the large furnace room where he'd been attempting his conjury. He took the chalk out and squatted on the limestone floor. He consulted the book to be sure he was drawing the diagram correctly. The size of the circle generally didn't really matter because things he was trying to call forth were not constrained by the physics of our world. This time it was slightly different, however. The circle had to be large enough to completely surround the item which was to be placed in its center. The item wasn't huge, but Ian wanted to be sure he had enough room. He made the circle about 10 feet in diameter. Then he drew the markings that the book instructed, which were supposed to help the thing find its way up from below and into the circle above. Once the circle was laid out upon the floor, Ian went into the back room and dragged the item out of his makeshift ritual chamber. It was pieced together precariously on a folding chair that he'd found in the garage. Ian was careful not to jostle it too much. It was fragile, and he didn't want to waste precious time reconstructing it. He managed to get the chair into the room without anything falling off or out of the object, and he maneuvered it into the center of the circle. He sighed with relief to find that he'd drawn the circle big enough to fully encompass it. He stood back and smiled for a moment, admiring his work. The item was a body that Ian had constructed for a being. As a person uncomfortable with religion, Ian tried not to think of them as demons. To inhabit, once it slithered up from whatever lightless nest it called home. The core of the body was made from 2 large lawn bags filled with fallen leaves. It was October, and they were abundant. His parents had been pleasantly surprised to come home and find the front and backyards neatly raked. He'd bought 4 brooms that he shoved through holes cut in the bags to suggest arms and legs, and then he'd thrown a very large, very old, brown and white Afghan over the top of it. On the area that Ian thought of as the face, he had sewn 2 large silver buttons to serve as eyes. Just beneath the buttons, he'd strung a piece of yarn, threaded with needles, to be its mouth. Looking at it slumped on the chair made him think of a scarecrow that had gotten too tired to stand in its field anymore. It was ugly, and it gave off a wet, fermenting odor, thanks to the leaves and the moldering Afghan. Ian couldn't conceive of what would happen if something did decide to take hold of this puppet. It made him nervous to imagine this thing suddenly filled with hideous life, standing and grinning through its sewing kit mouth. He wasn't sure that was something he wanted to see, but he knew time was fleeting, so he began the ritual. Ian reached into his case and took out 3 candles, placing them at points along the circle to form a triangle around it. He lit them and then stood carefully back, so he did not cross the boundary of the circle. He sprinkled some of the consecrated oil into the flames. The book said this would tempt the being upward. Then he took a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and gently unfolded it. It was a photograph of Samantha. She'd been caught off guard when this picture was taken, and her startled laughter had been frozen there forever. Looking at it filled him with the same old sadness and impotent rage. Taking the photo in one hand and the book in the other, Ian knelt on the floor in front of his scarecrow and said the words that would hopefully coax something to bring it to life. It was not the longest ceremony he had ever performed. It lasted about an hour and a half, but it was an hour and a half of intense focus. Ian had to try to concentrate all the rotten hurt and anger and sadness and loss into a single stream of will that could wrap around the words of the spell. He spoke slowly, not wanting to disturb the delicate atmosphere by stumbling over his words. Many minutes passed, and the small furnace room began to hum with gathering static electricity. Ian felt the hair on his arms go rigid, even as the temperature seemed to plummet. Everything in his field of vision faded away, except for the circle, the candles, and the lifeless body of leaves. Ian's heart began to beat faster. Something was about to happen. Then he fainted. When Ian awoke, he sat up, rubbing the back of his head where it had struck the hard floor. He looked to the chair in the center of the chalk circle. In the gently flickering candlelight, he saw that a scarecrow was no longer sitting in it, and the picture of Samantha was gone. He quickly scrambled to his knees and stood up, trying to look behind him. There was nothing there. Ian blinked in confusion, trying to understand what had happened. He didn't know how long he'd been lying on the floor unconscious. It could have been hours. Maybe his father had discovered him down here after arriving home and had disposed of the leaf man. No, Ian thought. He wouldn't leave me on the floor like that. He would have called an ambulance or something. He was having trouble forming coherent thoughts. His brain felt like it had been pulled through a meat grinder. He had decided to head upstairs to see if anyone had come home when he heard a shuffling sound coming from the back room. Ian spun around and peered into the darkness behind him. Deep in the gloom, a hulking, misshapen figure stood amongst the boxes. 2 green sparks burned within its shadowy form, 7 feet above the ground. Those are its eyes. Ian's breath caught in his throat. The spell had worked. There, hunched amidst a jumble of moth-eaten old clothes and old school papers, was an actual something from beyond the veil. Something that had animated the simulacrum Ian had constructed, so it could wreak the bloody reprisal that he himself could not. He waited, taking slow, ragged breaths as Ian stared wordlessly at it. He spent a few moments trying to remember what the book had told him to do if the summoning was successful. He took several steps back and turned to face the thing in the storage room. Ian bent and retrieved the book. He wasn't sure about the wording. I command you to come. He looked up hesitantly from the page to where the thing stood. A second or two later, it came shambling out of the darkness of the back room and into the slightly less dark hallway, stopping a few feet from Ian. The body was no longer what Ian had created. He had fashioned a mannequin out of unwanted objects and household items. What stood before him now, while still somewhat resembling the basic form of the construct, was something of flesh and bone, and hair and teeth and claws. It was much bigger than what Ian had made, both wider and taller. In fact, it towered over him. He looked up into its glowing green eyes with a mixture of wonder and terror. Its mottled brown hide, skin, pelt. Ian didn't know what to call it. Exterior was thick and wrinkled, like the flesh of a rhinoceros. Its underside, arms, and legs were all covered with long dark hair. The arms hung to the ground, each of them ending in 3 long curved talons that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. Its legs were short and thick and bent at the knees. The feet were long, flat paddles, tipped with uneven toes that twisted and forked like tree branches. There was no head or neck to speak of, only a flattened area near the top from which its eyes gleamed. Where Ian had strung its mouth was now a wide, grinning maw, filled with hundreds of crooked, overlapping needle teeth. Whatever it was that had left its underworld warren to answer Ian's summons had not just inhabited his simulacrum. It had formed a living, breathing body out of it. A body that looked perfectly well equipped to cause irreparable trauma to anyone who stood in the way of its dark pursuit. Ian's shock began to dissolve and became excitement. He glanced at the book and then stood up straighter, meeting the emerald gaze of his otherworldly assassin. "Creature, do you accept the terms of our contract?" The terms Ian was referring to had been declared during the summoning spell. By answering the call, the thing had essentially already accepted the offered terms, but form and tradition were important parts of the ritual, and Ian did not want to deviate from the book. "Will you stand as my emissary?" The simulacrum bent forward in what Ian took to be a nod and uttered a hollow, rattling growl. It seemed satisfied with the terms it had been offered. "And you know the one you seek?" Again it nodded and growled. "And you will return to me with the head, as proof that you have carried out my vengeance?" The creature dragged its claws along the floor and opened its mouth, letting forth a rumbling groan. It seemed to be smiling. Ian took this as a yes. He pointed toward the stairs. "Then go." At once the simulacrum gathered itself together and with a hissing shriek began dragging its bulk across the floor. Ian watched it pass and was struck again with awe and wonder. He wanted to reach out and touch it as it hunched by, but didn't dare. For a moment, the idea that he might either be dreaming, unconscious on the floor, or insane occurred to him. Any other person would have said that both possibilities were far more likely than what his senses told him was happening. He dismissed the thought quickly, though. If he was dreaming, then he would wake up at some point and realize it. If he was insane, well, what did it matter? This was the world he lived in, whether it was real or not. He still needed his closure. He needed revenge. Ian watched the thing's wide back as it turned the corner and began clomping up the stairs. It was a narrow staircase, and he hoped it would be able to get out without smashing through any walls. He walked out into the family room, and saw that the simulacrum had the ability to narrow and elongate its body. Why wouldn't it? He surprised himself by letting out a high-pitched giggle. Even if he wasn't insane right now, Ian thought he probably wasn't too far from it. The creature topped the stairs and disappeared from sight. A moment later, Ian heard the back door open and then slam shut. It was out in the world now. He went over to the stereo and put a Stranglers cassette in the player. The first song began to play, and Ian flopped down on the couch, waiting in the dark for his simulacrum to return with a head for him. Samantha woke to the sound of someone pounding on the door. She wondered if Charles was going to answer it. Probably not. She had no idea what time it was, but it felt late. The sky outside the window was dark. Huge clouds drifted slowly across a sliver of moon, like barges on an upside-down river. She turned her face into the pillow and sighed. She was lying on her stomach, naked. Her arms and legs were splayed across the dirty mattress, bound at the wrists and ankles by heavy nylon straps that stretched under the bed. Charles had set the straps on the inside of the bed frame between the front and back legs, so that Samantha couldn't slip them over the edges. She couldn't remember how long she'd been pinned that way, but it felt like a long time. From across the room, Samantha could hear Charles clacking away at the computer. He was watching porn, or else uploading videos of the things he'd been doing with her. She knew he did the former because she could hear the tinny sex sounds blaring from his small computer speakers, and she knew he did the latter because he told her so. "You ought to be proud. All kinds of people are going to be watching you." That had been on day one. His Computer City work shirt had been open, exposing his round, sweaty belly. He'd worn no pants, his boxers stretched between his ankles above his dark socks, and he fondled himself casually. "Does the idea of it turn you on?" The question had come out thick, his voice cracking. Samantha hadn't answered him. She didn't have to. Charles seemed to think everything turned her on. He chattered away at her, as if she enjoyed having his abundant bulk squashed down on top of her, as he grunted and heaved. He'd convinced himself that she found pleasure in the way he left streaks of Dorito dust on the sides of her breasts and thighs when he groped and probed her with his filthy fingers. Somehow, in Charles's mind, all of this was fulfilling some kind of dark fantasy that was burning within her. She doubted if he ever wondered whether she enjoyed being strapped to a mattress sodden with her own urine. It definitely didn't bother him. She was surprised that he even took the time and effort to clean her off when she had to do more than just pee. Though since he only spoon-fed her one bowl of soggy cereal a day, those times had become much less frequent. Across the room, Samantha heard the chair squeak as Charles leaned back and swiveled around the pounding on the door. She didn't bother turning her head to look at him, but heard him stand up, his underwear snapping as he pulled them over his jiggly hips. "Shh. Stay quiet now, sweetie." Sweetie. The way he whispered tenderly to her, as if they were in this together, made Samantha's skin crawl. She didn't make a sound. Charles had a large hunting knife that he'd shown her several times to encourage her not to struggle so much during their sessions. She thought that if she tried to call out now, he would surely use it on her. He hadn't bothered telling her to be quiet before, because his apartment was on the 6th floor of an old abandoned factory, on a block lousy with old abandoned factories. He told her that his brother owned the building and had wanted to turn it into a nightclub someday. He let Charles live there rent-free in exchange for keeping an eye on the place, and he almost never checked in on his strange, chubby brother. On that first day when she woke up, bound to the bed with him on her back, Charles told her that she could scream all she wanted. No one was going to hear her, and even if someone did, in this neighborhood, nobody was going to stick their nose in anyone else's business. She had stopped screaming for help on the 4th day. No one was coming to help her. Whoever it was outside was probably not there for her anyway. The police announced themselves when they went banging on doors. This person hadn't said a word. Samantha did not feel any hope at all. Anyone who was wandering these streets at this time of night and crawling into, supposedly deserted buildings, was almost certainly up to no good. They might even be worse than Charles. The pounding continued. It sounded like whoever was out there was using some kind of hard object on the door, like a baseball bat or a crowbar. It didn't have the muffled thud of a fist. It was a hard sound. It didn't matter what they had, though. They weren't getting in. Charles had made sure that his grubby little love den was well sealed off from anyone who might pry from the outside. The door was a metal fire door, its frame solidly set into brick. It would take a grenade to blow it off its hinges. Even if they could pick the lock or use a gun on it, Charles had 4 crossbars, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom, that bolted from the inside. The only vulnerable place in the room was the window, and that was 6 stories up from the ground on the face of the building. Nobody was getting into this apartment. Samantha could hear Charles breathing behind her, near the door. He didn't say anything to the intruder. He just stood and listened as the constant pounding went on and on. There was no break to its rhythm. If anything, it was getting louder and more insistent. It went on for what felt like forever before Charles finally spoke. "Hey, asshole, you're not coming in here." He meant to sound hard and menacing, but his voice came out petulant and weak. In a fair fight where he wasn't hidden in someone's back seat with a syringe full of sedative, Charles would have been a threat to no one, including Samantha. The hammering on the door didn't pause or slow down at the sound of his voice. Whoever was out there kept up their monotonous tempo with an eerie persistence. Samantha, who was desperate to be discovered, felt a chill spring up beneath the slimy sweat covering her bare back. She was afraid of Charles, and what he might do the longer he had her in this apartment. She knew that, as he got bored, their sessions might become even more horrifying. She also knew that eventually he would tire of dealing with her, or she would no longer be attractive to him, or he'd want someone else. And when that happened, that would certainly mean the end of her. Faced with those prospects, Samantha was still afraid of the person at the door, and what might happen to her if they got in. Charles was becoming agitated. Samantha could hear the sound of his feet padding on the floor as he paced back and forth in front of the door. He was making whining sounds in his throat, like a yappy little dog being teased. "What do you want?" He beat his fist impotently against his side of the door. "Huh? Who the fuck are you? I've got a gun." The pounding kept on, as if they knew he was lying. Samantha's heart was racing. Charles was panting behind her, mewling. He was melting down. She had no idea what he would do if he thought he might be caught with her. Probably he would kill her, and then himself. That's how these stories always seem to end. Charles began to sob loudly as he battered at the door with both fists. The person on the other side kept up their own pounding, and it soon formed a weird, syncopated rhythm. "You can't have her!" Charles's voice was a wet, blubbering mess. "She belongs to me!" he let out a strangled cry. "I love her!" The noise on the other side of the door kept up, implacable. As the person or people outside continued to bang on the door, Charles's weeping and hitching gradually dried up. He stood silently behind Samantha for some time, and this was even worse than his wheedling and crying. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and heavy, and she knew something was about to happen. "Fine then," Charles called out suddenly. "You can have her if you want her so bad. Hope you like dead pussy. I can always get another one." Samantha heard his footsteps as he came across the room toward her. Her face twisted with sorrow, and tears streamed from her eyes. She couldn't believe that this was how she was going to meet her end. Before Charles could reach her to do whatever it was he planned on doing, there was a huge boom and a roaring metal shriek. Charles stopped dead in his tracks. There was another boom and another deafening squeal. There was the dusty sound of crumbling brick and the ting of several small metal somethings hitting the floor. Suddenly, Samantha knew that somehow the door had been torn from its hinges. Whoever was out there had gotten in. She couldn't see what was happening, but she heard everything. When the door crashed to the floor, Charles began to scream. From further back, near the empty doorway, came a low, rumbling growl. Heavy, scraping footsteps shuffled over the threshold and into the room. Charles seemed to be trying to form words, but it all came out in an ululating howl. Samantha heard his feet thudding against the floor as he backed toward her, and then suddenly, he tripped and fell over on top of her. She whipped her head to the side to try to see what was going on, but the intruder was well beyond her field of vision. The only thing she saw was a voluminous shadow falling across her as the person stepped forward and reached out for Charles. Charles was kicking his legs and flailing his arms. His feet were drumming painfully into Samantha's exhausted calves. Then his weight was lifted off her entirely. Whoever was back there was huge and incredibly strong. Samantha began to scream. She didn't know what else to do. She didn't understand what was happening, and she didn't know how this would end. She only knew that if she didn't open her mouth and let out the terror, it was going to split her open and spill her insides out. She and Charles made a nightmare duet as their soaring wails mingled in shrill harmony. Then Charles's cries were cut short with a wet, ripping sound, like a very thick piece of cloth being torn along a seam. Something hot and wet rained down onto Samantha's body. It splashed against her face and rolled down her cheek like heavy tears. It pooled on the pillow, and Samantha could see that it was blood. Her breath caught in her throat, and she strained helplessly against the straps that held her down. Samantha heard something heavy fall to the floor behind her and knew that the intruder had just dropped Charles's body. She tried to plead for her life as they stomped toward the bed, but no sound came out. Suddenly, she couldn't remember how to speak. She felt the person's immense bulk lean over her and heard its wheezing breath. Since they'd begun knocking on the door, they hadn't uttered a single word. Something sharp pressed softly against Samantha's leg near her ankle. It felt like some kind of huge, curved knife. It slid down her leg, and she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for it to cut into her flesh. Instead, it sliced through the strap holding her leg to the bed. It did the same thing on the other side. It leaned even farther over. No person could possibly be tall enough to lean that far, could they? And cut the straps that held her wrists. She was free. her rescuer stood up and waited, making no sound except to breathe. After a few moments of silence, the tiniest glimmer of hope crept into Samantha's mind that she might actually escape this awful dream. She didn't want to let it. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the false friend who told you everything was going to be okay, and then, when you realized that nothing was going to be okay, it pushed you off the ledge, laughing. Still, no matter what happened next, she'd at least be able to move her arms and legs. That evened the odds at least a little bit. After lying on her stomach a few moments longer, Samantha finally rolled onto her back for the first time since she'd been brought to the apartment. Her muscles screamed, Charlie horses twisting inside both calves, her shoulders pinched with a delirious ache. She opened her eyes, wanting to see the person who had cut her free. Whatever she had expected, this was not it. She didn't even understand what she was looking at. Suddenly, her heart sank, and her hopes slipped away like steam. She realized she must actually be dreaming, because what stood before her was not human. She didn't know what it was. She'd never seen anything like it before, in any book or movie. She looked up and up, until she found its glowing green eyes. There was a lot of hair and a mouth filled with what looked like hundreds of shiny sewing needles. She sighed. Damn it, I thought this was real. She pushed herself painfully up to a sitting position, wincing at the way her thighs stretched and burned. She took a closer look at the monster standing in front of her. She was amazed at how detailed her imagination could be. She would never have suspected that such wells of fantastic invention were hiding within her. Then she saw that it held Charles's dripping, severed head in its left claw, his mutilated body lying on the floor a few feet away. She was spattered with his drying blood. Dream or not, the terror came flooding back in, and Samantha began to scream again. At the sound of her voice, the thing stepped toward her, reaching its arms out. Samantha's eyes widened, and her throat was scoured with the force of her cry. Finally, as her brother Ian had done earlier that same evening, miles away, Samantha fainted. Ian's parents had called him at 11:30 and told him they might not be home till very, very late. Ian had said that was fine, and they should try to have a good time. As he hung up the phone, he wondered if, subconsciously, they knew to stay away that night. He sat on the couch in the upstairs living room and fell asleep waiting. Sometime later, he awoke to a sound at the back door. It was a furtive shuffling noise, followed by a soft tap, tap, tap on the outer window pane. Unreality washed over him as he stood up and walked through the dark kitchen and into the back dining room. Outside the window, he saw something large moving amongst the shadows. The tapping came again for a moment and stopped. Ian's heart was pounding. He tried to swallow, but could only manage a dry click at the back of his throat. Summoning up as much courage as he could, he stepped to the back door, undid the latch, and opened it. There on the steps, folded up in their grandmother's old brown and white afghan, was Ian's younger sister, Samantha. Her eyes were closed, and she wasn't moving. She had been missing for 3 weeks. The police had come up with no solid leads. No trace of her could be found, except for her empty car, discovered in the parking lot of an all-night diner. There'd been a massive search party that turned up no further clue to her whereabouts. Ian and his parents had been frantic, All anyone knew was that she'd stormed off one night after arguing with their mother about where she was going to go to college, and she had never come back. Ian stepped out the door and leaned over her. There were splotches of blood on her face and arms, but he could see that she was breathing. For a moment, he didn't move. He was afraid if he did, then this dream would simply break apart, like clouds after a storm, and she would be gone again. When he could stand it no longer, Ian crouched down and slid his arm under his sister's neck. He could tell she was naked beneath the Afghan, and wondered what nightmares she had endured out there in the heartless world. He cradled her to his chest and began rocking back and forth. Tears formed at the corners of his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. A moment later, with a fluttering of her eyelids, Samantha woke up. She looked into her brother's worried face and smiled. "This has turned into a really great dream, big brother," she whispered hoarsely. "Shh, it's not a dream. I sent someone to come find you." This reminded Ian of the simulacrum, and he looked up and out into the night. There was no sign of it. The Afghan that Ian had used as part of its body was now swaddling his sister. A large pile of dead leaves swirled in a sudden breeze that swept through the yard, but nothing else stirred in the darkness. A severed human head stared back at Ian from his parents' picnic table. Blood seeped out from the ragged stump of its neck. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its lifeless eyes bulged. Ian smiled. He had been promised proof that his vengeance had been carried out on the man who had hurt his sister, and there it was, bleeding on the patio. Ian had never expected that his creature would also return Samantha to their family alive. He hadn't even been sure she still was alive when he'd begun delving into his dark pursuit. She muttered a tearful thank you as he held Samantha close to him. And from somewhere out in the night, something seemed to answer him with a low, guttural growl.
That was Simulacrum, written by R.K. Kombrinck, performed by Geoff Sturtevant. And if you ever wonder whether love and hate could live in the same breath, tonight you have your answer. What would you have done in Ian's shoes? Would you go that far to bring someone home? Would you dare call something that listens from the other side? If you enjoyed tonight's tale, be sure to check out more of R.K. Kombrinck's writing and visit veloxbooks.com, home to cutting-edge indie horror, dark fantasy, and supernatural thrillers. They're helping keep the future of horror sharp, strange, and unforgettable. If tonight's tale left a chill in your spine, or a growl in the dark corner of your mind, and you just can't get enough, consider supporting Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in. Watching on YouTube? Like, comment, and subscribe. It's the best way to keep these nightmares crawling into your feed. And don't forget, you can dive deeper into the darkness by becoming a patron at chillingtalesfordarknights.com. For just $7.99 a month, or even less annually, you'll get early access to episodes, exclusive tales, and ad-free listening that's just for you. Also, join our community on Facebook, Instagram, and X to talk horror with fellow fans and get sneak peeks behind the scenes. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and as always, it's been a pleasure creeping into your ears. Tune in every Monday and Wednesday for more terrifying tales, where we'll once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Until next time, sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.
Chilling tales for dark nights.